Welcome to Amateur Radio Digital Voice Modes. This video covers cross-mode operation with a DMR radio and an Openspot 4 Pro. This video is presented by Gary C. Meyer, W0DYD, W0 Dunk Your Donuts, Shakopee, Minnesota. It's November 2022. I'd like to give you a little introduction to myself and kind of what my background is, both in ham radio and in the industrial field as well. My experience in ham radio, I was licensed in 1951 with WN0DYD, and we've been on a lot of different modes down through the years. My experience with digital radio started just a little over a year ago when I picked up a TYT MD390 DMR handheld and a little DVM hotspot. We used these for about a year, enjoyed DMR, and was kind of a steep learning curve, as many of you know. However, we kind of mastered that, and then just a few weeks ago, which is in November here of 2022 right now, we acquired the Openspot Pro 4 and have been programming that to do some cross-mode operation. So in this video, we'd like to kind of share some of the experiences that we have had. My work background includes about 62 years of electronic servicing, also sales as a manufacturer's rep, and teaching in a technical college for 14 years in computers and electronics. Let's go on to look at the content for this particular presentation. Part 1, titled The Basics, is meant for the newcomer to DMR, or it might be good to have a refresher for those who have been on DMR and looking to do cross-mode for the first time. In Part 1, called The Basics, we will cover a brief introduction to digital radio, and then also talk about some concepts and terminology for using a DMR radio on other digital voice modes such as DSTAR and Fusion, called cross-mode operation. Watch Part 2 of this series to set up an Anytone 878 UV2 Plus radio or any DMR radio with the Openspot 4 Pro hotspot. And this will give you a step-by-step introduction to that setup. So let's go with Part 1, the basics. First, for some very basics, since we're dealing with a DMR radio here to start out with, is that these are the elements that you will need if you are just looking to get into digital radio and want to enter it via the way of DMR, which stands for Digital Mobile Radio. You'll need that mobile radio. This can either be a handheld or it can be a base station type rig or a mobile rig. Many of them on the market. The two that I have is, or three actually, the MD390 and the Anytone UV2 Plus, and then I have the Anytone D578 mobile rig, which I use as a base station. So you'll need a DMR radio, and then the idea here is that you need to use that DMR radio to access the internet, which holds different servers, and our connection to those servers then allow us to talk to other ham radio operators all over the world. You need an ID number in order to use those DMR radios, and they can be applied for at radioid.net. So besides the DMR radio, you'll also need, there's two ways of accessing the internet here and those servers. One is by using a hotspot, and this is a little device that goes into your home that connects your Wi-Fi into the internet, and in the internet then are the DMR servers, which are called talk groups. So there's many different talk groups and many different subjects that are being carried on these talk groups. So whichever ones interest you, you are able to connect to those and speak with others that have a similar interest. Another way to access the talk groups is through your DMR radio and what's called a DMR repeater. You would need a DMR repeater in your area in order to use this method of connection, and those can be searched out on the internet by looking for them on Google. So the idea then is to use your radio, which is an RF connection, usually on either 2 meters or 70 centimeters to your hotspot, out to the talk group, or through your DMR radio RF connection to your DMR repeater. There's very little power required since the distance is very short, usually maybe even a few feet within the home. Or if you want to use this configuration for mobile operation, you can use a cell phone, and as long as you have a good cell phone connection, you can access the cell phone, or the talk groups rather, through this cell phone connection as well. Another type of digital radio is called DSTAR. DSTAR stands for Digital Smart Technology for Amateur Radio. When buying a radio, you can buy a DMR radio or you can buy a DSTAR radio. If you have a DSTAR radio, then you need a hotspot that can be programmed to DSTAR. That connection is the same then from the hotspot to the internet as we discussed on the previous slide. Also, there are DSTAR repeaters, and using a DSTAR radio, you can go through the repeater and access different what we called talk groups on DMR. They're called reflectors on DSTAR, and so there's a number of different reflectors that again have different subjects. There are some of those that are worldwide, to talk to amateurs all over the world. There are some that are local, some regional, some state, and whichever area you want to talk to, you can access all of the different reflectors here. Another type of digital radio is what's called the Fusion, or YSF is abbreviation for the Yaesu System Fusion. And System Fusion is Yaesu's implementation of digital amateur radio utilizing what's called C4FM 4. This is a level of FSK technology, or frequency shift keying technology. The same principles apply here, that if you buy a Fusion radio, then you'll either need the Fusion hotspot, one that's programmable, or a repeater, that is a Fusion repeater, YSF repeater, in order to access the various networks on the internet for Fusion. The Openspot 4 Pro also provides support for two other types of digital radios. One is NXDN, the other is P25. NXDN stands for the Next Generation Digital Narrowband, where P25 is the standardized two-way digital radio communications platform used by the government and public safety organizations throughout North America. I know very little about these, so I'll leave these to some other experts for a presentation. Now that we've taken a look at the block diagram for digital radio and talked about some of the different modes of digital radios, let's look at the practical side here and some of the equipment that you will need. First of all, we've mentioned that you would need a radio of DMR or DSTAR or whatever you're using. In this particular video we're talking about DSTAR, so I've shown here my Anytone 878 UV2 Plus, and that is connected by RF over to a hotspot. A couple of different hotspots or types of hotspots that I've shown here. One is the Pi-Star system. This is a very popular microcomputer here, which has been adapted for taking the RF signal from your DMR radio and changing it into a connection, or I should say serving as an interface, as a connection into the internet to go to different talk groups. The Pi-Star system can be built up, if you're familiar with Pi-Star, by putting on the little computer what's called a Pi-Star hat, and that will then give you that connection. There's a lot of different iterations of this, and also the Pi-Star has a chip in it that needs to be programmed to make it work with the DMR radio. It's a micro SD that's used for this purpose. The second type of hotspot is one called a Openspot. This is a particular brand, but one that's very popular, and that again your Anytone radio, or your, I should say, your DMR radio will connect to that with RF. And then the hotspot here will do what's called Crossmode, and we're going to talk more about that, and allows your DMR radio then to connect over to some of the other modes that we have just been talking about here. In the Pi-Star system, this can be set up for usually for just a single channel, or a single mode rather, and that is if you have a DMR radio, you can program it to use DMR. If you have a DSTAR radio, you can program it for DSTAR operation and so forth. But the advantage here on the Openspot is that you can use just one type of radio. You could use a DSTAR radio and program this to go to all of the different modes that we've been talking about, or with a DMR radio we can switch over to DSTAR or Fusion, and also to the or use it as a DMR hotspot as well. And that's what we're going to be talking about, the setup in later on in this presentation. The difference here between the Pi-Star system and the Openspot also is that you program up on a chip, or have it programmed for you, a micro SD, which holds the operating system then for the particular mode that you're using, where here we have embedded software, no plug-in chip, and this one also typically this one has a battery included inside of it, and it's a rechargeable battery, Where on the Pi-Star systems, normally it's an outboard power plug USB type of power supply. As mentioned previously, the Pi-Star system needs to be programmed, and that programming is done with a computer. And if you have a DMR radio, you need to program it for DMR to access the various talk groups. Or if you have a DSTAR radio, you need to program the chip in here with your computer for the DSTAR access to the reflectors on the internet. So the Openspot 4 has what's called an AMBI chip in it, an AMBI system, and there's no programming required because this is all in firmware. And you can use any type of digital radio, DMR or DSTAR or Fusion, YSF, in order to access the different modes, and this is called cross modes. Here's a little visual that might help you understand how the Openspot 4 Pro works. And for doing a cross mode operation, it does take this special hotspot. And first of all, we have our DMR radio coming into the hotspot, and then you can view it like a switch that we can switch from DMR over to DSTAR, or we can switch it down here to Fusion. We'll be just working with just these three different modes here. So from your DMR radio, we have the RF connection, either 2 meters or 70 centimeters, sending the signals into the Openspot 4 Pro, and switching DMR, DSTAR, or Fusion on the output here, one at a time. Now we get a little more into the nitty-gritty here of how the Anytone 878 can be set up, or any DMR radio actually set up to control the mode of operation of the Openspot. I had to do a little digging to find this, but it's pretty clear in the manual once you find that. But then who reads the manual first, right? So here's the Anytone, and if we program this up, either there's a couple of different methods of doing this, but what the Openspot 4 Pro needs over here is a signal to make the switching between DMR and the other modes. So if you send out a signal here on talk group 9001, then this switches to DMR. If you can do that in a couple of different ways, and we'll discuss that in the setup. Likewise, sending a signal for talk group 9002 as though you're going to connect to that talk group. It'll send that RF signal over to the Openspot, and that'll switch it to the DSTAR mode. So now you can talk on your DMR radio on the DSTAR reflectors. In the programming, we'll set up to connect to some of the different reflectors. Likewise, the other cross mode of Fusion can be switched by putting in the talk group 9003 from the DMR radio. A beautiful feature of the Openspot 4 Pro is that it talks back to your handheld or radio, and it does that by talking on the local 9 or S local 9 talk group. So by putting the radio on the S local 9, you will hear the Openspot responding with an audio voice signal that the switching has been made, whether you're switching between DMR, DSTAR, or Fusion, by putting in that 9001, 2, or 3 into as the switch control signal in here. Now let's take a look at the more detailed operation of setting up the Anytone 878 with the Openspot 4 Pro hotspot. The topics that we'll now be covering, and probably most of you have been looking for this spot in the video here to set up the radio and the Openspot together. The topics that I will cover here include setting up the hotspot, first of all using the Openspot 4 Pro dashboard, and then secondly setting up the DMR radio using the computer to switch the Openspot for various cross-mode methods there. Also, the operation of cross-mode, I'll give you a couple of different ways of doing that. One is kind of a convenience way and probably a little more classy way of making the presentation for switching, and the other is really a simple way, and as long as you remember which numbers there to plug in for the various talk groups to do the switching, it's an easy way without even touching the code plug. So for what I call the convenience method here, we'll go through what you might want to do to set up the code plug if you're into programming. If you're not into programming, the simple method works very well. I've tried both of them, and they work very well for switching the Openspot 4.